Damn.
Shooter fans are finally starting to eat good this month, first with the release of the awesome mullet Mad Jack, a game which hit overwhelmingly positive so quickly on Steam that it made my head spin. Not to mention what's more or less System Shock meets the Soviet Union, with Sonar Shock also dropping mere days ago. And now we've got Selaco, an incredibly badass title running on the GZ Doom engine and developed by Altered Orbit Studios. Which I've got no doubt is shortly going to be following in Jack's footsteps. I remember first seeing footage of this thing on Twitter, back when it was called Twitter, pretty much what felt like an eternity ago. And throughout the years, the devs have been silently working away on this thing in the shadows, only now finally unleashing its first episode. Which feels like a combination of an immersive sim, along with being one of the most hardcore boomer shooters ever made. Yeah man, in Selaco, you'll spend a fair bit of time getting your ass kicked. However, that is absolutely by design, not to mention it's a game that's also going to let you give it back twice as much, really having some of the most satisfying gunplay ever. It's another one of those instances too where I'm going to recommend something before even explaining why. And again, like if all you want to know is if it's worth it, then yes, it is. In fact, go buy this thing right now, and then come back to the comments section later on and you can thank me. Right, so before I get too far into the review, I do have to thank World of Warships for sponsoring this video. World of Warships is a free-to-play, naval-themed multiplayer game for the Xbox, PlayStation, and the PC. It's the perfect blend of strategy and combat as you take to the waters with over 500 different vessels that span 10 different nations and all different periods of history. In fact, the developers have actually said too that it takes around 6 months to create a ship from start to finish. And then if you consider that they've got around 500 in the game, well, then it's worth checking out just for that effort alone.
No, he's got a point.
But if you need more, then World of Warships is collaborating with Azure Lane from May 15th to June 28th, where naval strategy meets naval shoot-em-ups. With this new update comes a whole bunch of fully voiced commanders like Shimakaze, Queen Elizabeth, and Hornet. Plus you got new Azure Lane themed skins which really make you stand out on the battlefield, or is that the battle sea? Anyway, all of this new content can be used in single player or multiplayer modes, so you can show off all that new content to the world or keep it to yourself. And if you are a new player, you can even use my link in the description, code SithWave Azure Lane, and you get a ton of bonuses for joining the fleet, including 7 days of a premium account, 1.5 million credits, and 600 doubloons. So download World of Warships today and take on the high seas with your mates, and yeah, look awesome while you're doing it. And thanks again to World of Warships for sponsoring this video. Now, in typical boomer shooter fashion, the plot in Selaco is more or less wafer thin. What little story there is that you're playing as Dawn, a high-ranking officer on the ACE security team, tasked with protecting the eponymous Selaco base after it's come under attack by some kind of hostile military force. And in a fortunate turn of events that is incredibly convenient for YouTubers, these bad guys all seem to have pink blood. Anyway, in the opening of the game, Dawn wakes up in hospital and then is immediately being hunted down, soon getting her hands on her armor and then some guns, before then working her way through these 6 different levels in the first episode to try to find out what's going on. You've got the hospital, underground sewers and tunnels, a shopping mall, along with a couple other environments that I'm not going to spoil, all of which are intricate and incredibly detailed. Dawn's also voiced by Melissa Medina, who played the main character Rebecca in The Mortuary Assistant.
Alright, here we go.
Which is another really good indie game that everyone should play.
No, I don't think I will.
Here though in Selaco, she's not really all that talkative, barely uttering more than like a single sentence here and there. I mean, it's not like she's dropping one-liners every time she kills a bad guy or anything like that. So I guess my point there is, don't expect too much in the way of the story, because there really is bugger all going on in that regard. And outside of a few encounters against these tougher Juggernaut-style enemies, there's not even any kind of main villain or overarching antagonists. Your journey throughout the first episode is wholly untouched though, and there's never any moment where you lose control and have to sit through cutscenes, cinematics, or dialogue. So in that regard, it's almost kind of similar to something like Half-Life, with the player making this organic journey through a real and palpable game world, one which is completely connected from beginning to end. Which also too in some ways has made me draw some comparisons to Phantom Fury. And what I really find kind of funny here is that these guys have unironically made a better Phantom Fury game than Slipgate Ironworks and 3D Realms did. I mean, for starters, both games start with your character waking up, and then you're playing as a badass female soldier fighting back against this vast, intimidating and hostile military force, all with the backdrop of this futuristic science fiction setting. There's also an emphasis on world building, exploration, not to mention a high amount of environmental interactivity, with levels seamlessly flowing into the next area. Dawn and Shelley even look kinda similar as well, down to their armor and everything. The only difference is that Selaco is actually fun to play, and doesn't feel like the whole thing's just completely hobbled together. Plus, it really represents the absolute best aspects of what indie games are supposed to be, that being games made by gamers for gamers. And Selaco's packed with all these random little references and Easter eggs, not to mention nods to its inspirations, most notably the Fear series, but then even Resident Evil to some degree as well, with these similarly styled safe rooms being a bit of a haven away from combat. I mean, let me just compare the music in both of these as an example. Not only do these areas offer up weapon stations where you can purchase various upgrades, but then there's also an underground fast travel system that lets you go back and forth between already discovered safe rooms. But even just during the moment-to-moment gameplay, it seems everywhere you look there's some kind of subtle or not so subtle reference or a visual joke.
Emotional damage!
They even managed to sneak in a reference to H-Doom, so yeah, we're clearly dealing with developers of absolute culture. It's kind of crazy to think as well that the whole thing's running on the GZ Doom engine, especially considering the amount of detail in these environments. I said before how it's almost an immersive sim at times, and a lot of that really comes from this high amount of environmental interaction. You can turn lights on and off or activate window shutters. You can pick up more or less every single proper object in the game world and throw it around, or yeah, just shoot it too and watch how it disintegrates. You can drink individual cans of soda, you can eat bananas and hamburgers, and flush too many bog rolls down the toilet and it'll eventually explode. Funny fact too, I actually did that in primary school in the 2nd grade one time and got suspended for a week. Weakened walls can be destroyed with explosives, which not only sounds and looks awesome, but offers up shortcuts or access to secret areas, of which there are dozens in total. Like finding keycards to get into locked storage cabinets, or upgrading your security clearance level to get to all these sealed off areas. And quite a lot of these secrets often require a bit of backtracking later on in the game, after you've actually found all these relevant security clearance levels.
Security clearance is set.
So yeah, like let's just say that these completionist types are gonna have their work cut out for them over the next few weeks. Best thing of all though is that Selaco effortlessly captures that feeling of utter chaos when the bullets finally start firing, with every surface and object reacting in an exaggerated fashion, sending dust and other particles in all directions, often to the point that you often can't see jack shit. I think my favourite effect here is when you shoot this stack of metal pipes and they all just fly into the air and clang around. Something's absolutely got to be said here as well for the awesome sound design, which is really solid across the board, with chunky, eardrum rupturing effects during combat and the explosions being a definite highlight. And in fact too, like a lot of the audio work is giving the player some really helpful clues, like hearing the enemy talk about whether they're pushing or flanking, or hearing a lone soldier saying they're the last one left alive, letting you know that the odds have finally tipped in your favour.
Time to go to work.
I also found the music to be that perfect blend of non-invasive background stuff, but then also heightening the cool factor to all of these shootouts. So it's music that feels like it's working alongside the player's actions as opposed to drowning them out. Enemy sprites are also really well animated and detailed as well. Hit someone with a melee attack or a slide and they'll topple over and lose balance. And you'll even see wounded enemies crawling around on the ground without their legs at times. It turns out too that those red hit markers during combat actually become really useful as well, considering that during all the pandemonium it'd be next to impossible to track when you've actually killed someone. So that simple visual cue of a red hit marker gets the message across in a really awesome and unobtrusive way. About all it's missing is a bullet time mode to really let you appreciate all those effects in slow motion, but then on the other hand, I kinda respect the devs for just not including that feature, and otherwise just sticking to their guns. Yeah, no pun intended. And on that note too, what's great about Selaco's weapons is that pretty much every single one of them is not only effective but also devastating, especially when used in conjunction with the multitude of weapon upgrades and kits you'll come across. Now, on the one hand, weapon upgrades are purchased through the safe room, and these include things like reduced recoil, larger magazine size, or extra damage. Whereas the weapon kits are found out and about in the world, and basically just offer up different alternate fire modes. The first weapon you'll come across is the assault rifle, which is pretty standard, but does do decent damage and has a zoom feature to make precise shots a lot easier. There's a weapon kit for this one that gives it a burst fire mode, but better than that, there's a kit that gives it a grenade launching alternate fire mode. And if Scarface has taught me anything, it's that this is one of the all-time best combinations.
Say hello to my little friend!
Not to mention that movie also taught me that apparently cocaine makes you bulletproof. Sharing the same ammo type is the submachine gun, which is kinda weak on its own, but you do get a very handy weapon kit early on that lets you carry a second one to dual wield them. Plus there's also a taser alternate fire mode which can stun enemies for a short period of time, which is kinda useful if you wanna watch a 2D sprite look like it's having a goddamn seizure. I mostly just use this gun for dealing with those sudden waves of tiny exploding robots, which come at you so quickly and erratically that a fast-firing weapon like the submachine gun is kind of essential in dealing with their bullshit. Now, as a general rule of thumb, it seems that most starting pistols in shooters are often about as effective as trying to erode away granite by pissing on it. Luckily, Selaco's pistol, aptly named the Roaring Cricket, is a goddamn semi-automatic hand cannon, which does great damage on its own, but then also has a really useful weapon kit where it can fire 2 or even 3 shots in burst fire mode, which absolutely shreds through even some of the tougher enemies. Next up, and ripped straight out of Fear's arsenal, is the Penetrator, which, funnily enough, is the same nickname your mum gave me. Now this thing is more or less the exact same weapon. It's a somewhat slower firing nail gun that has the awesome side effect of sometimes nailing enemies to nearby walls. And in the infamous words of Major Dutch, stick around.
Stick around.
And then one of the weapon kits for this thing lets you drop down a little nail turret, which fires at nearby enemies until it either runs out of ammo or gets destroyed. But it's the shotgun though, where the combat gets absolutely unhinged. And Selaco is definitely going to go down in the annals of FPS history for just how ridiculously badass this boomstick is.
Damn.
I've always said that the VK12 in Fear is the all-time best gaming shotgun, but Selaco's gives it a real good run for its money. Now this thing isn't so much as a shotgun as it is an anti-material weapon. And that is to say that whatever you shoot at is pretty much going to cease to exist from that point on. Shooting someone at point blank range results in this giant shower of pink bodily fluids and dissected body parts, leaving every nearby surface covered in arterial liquids. And it's a level of hit feedback that is just absolutely insane. I mean, you really feel like you're sending someone to a completely different time and space. And to make these jibs even more ludicrous, there's even an upgrade which increases the amount of gore you get from kills, which offers up no tactical advantage whatsoever. It just looks fucking awesome. Enemies also carry this thing around as well, and there's a very distinct red glow you see from these engineer enemies who carry one just before they fire, which is often accompanied by a swift death if you didn't get out of the way fast enough. So, all up, it's a suitably devastating weapon. And if a shotgun is the kind of thing that would be nerfed to oblivion in a multiplayer game, well, then you know these guys have done their job right. About halfway through the episode, you'll find the grenade launcher, which is pretty self-explanatory and effective in pretty much any given situation. The alternate grenade types offer up a few different options here as well, with the acid grenades leaving behind a damaging cloud for a few seconds, and then the ice grenade freezing enemies in place, which is probably to in some way also another nod to the Resident Evil series, with both those grenade types featuring heavily in a lot of the Resident Evil games. Oh yeah, and hands down too, the grenade launcher has one of the best weapon kits in the entire game, pretty much turning it into a rocket launcher, and removing the drop-off when firing from long distances. There's also a purchasable upgrade that lets you empty the entire chamber by holding down the fire button, making it even more ruthless. One of the weapons I found myself using the least though was the sniper rifle. Not because it's bad, but really because you only need to use it against other snipers. And those moments are about as rare as the amount of times your mum's left her clothes on. Then finally, there's the plasma rifle and the railgun. Now the plasma rifle is just more or less your run-of-the-mill energy-based weapon, which pretty much any FPS worth its salt is going to have to include. I mean, look man, we've been killing things with plasma rifles since 1993, and I can't see that changing anytime soon. But what is kind of neat about the plasma rifle is that it has a weapon kit that pretty much turns it into the gravity gun from Half-Life 2.
Come again?
So yeah man, like on the off chance you get sick of reducing someone to a fine mist with the shotgun, why not see how they like taking a barrel to the face at supersonic speeds? And then as for that railgun, well, that's kind of what you'd expect. And you're not really going to get too much game time out of this thing, simply because it's more or less an optional weapon that you don't unlock until right near the end of the campaign. This requires not only finding all 6 security clearance cards, but then also blasting your way through 4 different departments of this completely separate facility. It is kind of worth it though, because this weapon is absolutely broken, and it makes that last area a complete breeze, which is probably why they hid that thing away for so long. Now, all of these weapons by themselves would be fine, but it's the way that it all works in cohesion with the enemy AI and the environments which really brings the whole thing to life. Because there's just so many ways you can interact with the environment to your advantage during combat. I mean, just as an example, putting to use all those various explosive barrels placed around all these different levels. You can close shutter windows to give yourself extra cover, you can sneak around enemies to ambush them, or just lay traps with explosive proximity mines. Often you can put friendly turrets to use, or chuck out a fire extinguisher and then shoot it for a quick and easy kill. Grenades are also kinda hard to come by as well, to the point that you'll often have not more than 1 or 2 in your inventory. But when you chuck one out, you'll soon understand why. And that's because even a single well-thrown grenade can instantly turn the tide of a fight in your favour. Just all gives the whole thing some much needed substance, and while it is kind of easy to play this as a straight shooter and just fight everything head on, I feel like taking the time to experiment with the environment and play with all these other elements is where everything really starts to shine. I mean, even just continually finding weapon parts and kits throughout the campaign was enough to keep me hooked. And yeah, throughout the game, you're constantly finding weapon parts scattered around, which are what you then spend on upgrading all those various guns. Aside from that, you're also earning weapon parts by completing milestones, which are kind of like achievements you get during the moment-to-moment gameplay, like killing a certain amount of enemy types or finding enough data logs. And it's just kind of like the devs have really found a way to tap into that constant feeling of reward you get from completing these mini objectives. Not to mention, like, all I ever wanted to do after getting another weapon upgrade was just go right back out there and see how it worked in action. Let's not forget one really important fact though, and that is that Selaco is often tough as balls, especially if you're playing on hard mode or up. But there is definitely something kind of enjoyable here about finishing a gunfight with only a slither of health left, and all your weapons running empty and needing to be reloaded. It's kind of like the end scene in Scarface. You know when Tony Montana goes on a fucking rampage and starts shooting up all those Colombians, getting winged constantly in the process? Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that. And while the combat is pretty damn brutal, it is also somewhat forgiving. I mean, if your health ever drops below 35, for instance, if you can avoid damage for a few seconds, it's going to regenerate back up to 35, which is a pretty fair mechanic in a game which is otherwise constantly teabagging the player. I will say though too that a lot of the combat in Selaco is dependent on hindsight. And by that I mean that when the shooting is at its best is often after you're replaying a section after having just been killed. I mean look, like the long and short of it is that you never quite know when or where enemies are going to come from. And because of how insanely quickly you take damage, you can often be killed within seconds after they spawn in. I mean, like as an example, like there's a point where I walked past an invisible trigger that then spawned in a bunch of plasma troopers who appeared out of a nearby room and melted me in seconds. But then, after reloading a recent save, I obviously knew they were coming and I made sure to return the favour, which was incredibly cathartic. So it's not a bad thing, but it is something that's going to happen quite a bit, and it sure as hell doesn't get any easier the further you get into the campaign. And the reason for that is because enemies are also getting stronger the further you get, with the inclusion of this invasion system which adds in new factors and enemy variants. For instance, you'll start seeing guys with energy shields, or you might see squad leaders that can buff up the abilities of nearby soldiers. And for me, a lot of the best moments and sequences came after being killed, with the knowledge of knowing that these pricks were coming and planning accordingly. Having said all of that, look, it's not perfect, and there are some aspects here and there to Selaco that brought my piss to an absolute boil. Like the reliance on those little flying and crawling robot enemies to frequently ambush the player. I mean, look, it's not fun, it's not creative, it's just kind of annoying having a bunch of these metallic dickwads coming out of nowhere to knock off your entire health bar.
Access granted.
Ouch!
Then there's those explosive mines which you need to actively watch out for and avoid. Now you gotta trigger these by throwing objects at them from a distance. But you'd be surprised how easy it is to overlook them and just walk over it like a complete dickhead, which is something I did multiple times.
I guess you didn't see that, did you?
Doesn't help either that Dawn moves really slowly, and she's got the kind of movement speed that feels like what happens in another game if you accidentally turned off auto run. Now this is fine for maybe like the first few levels in the game, but throughout the campaign the game is slowly adding in those more challenging opponents through that whole invasion system. And you're going to start seeing tougher and faster enemies, which makes Dawn's movement speed really just a bit of an outright handicap. The issue is that you're really limited in the ability to get out of harm's way, and although there is that slide move, the cooldown for this thing is so long that it's really no help when you're trying to retreat in a hurry. And the fact that the environments are so detailed and intricate also makes it a bit of a double-edged sword, meaning that a sideways or backwards dash doesn't really save your bacon either. By far the best move there is sliding and then jumping, which gives you this massive boost in speed. But because of the cooldown, a lot of the time you're just going to be stuck in a bad position, and really be forced to take a huge bite out of a monumentally large shit sandwich. The only other thing I'd bring up is how there is bugger all story in the game, you know, like at all. There's not any kind of opening cutscene or anything that sets up the game, and the whole thing just starts in that hospital where Dawn wakes up and is already under attack by enemies. What then follows is a pretty lonely and solitary journey, as Dawn seems to be the only other person who's still left alive. This also often results in a lot of downtime in between combat, with there being these 10 or 15 minute sequences where you just move through these empty areas doing basic puzzles. Puzzles which more often than not involve pushing a barrel around and putting it onto some kind of pressure plate, before then finally enemies spawn out of the goddamn walls and you can shoot something. Now in Selaco's defense, a lot of the storytelling does come from the world building, and there's also lots of notes and tidbits and all the various personal logs you come across as well, but virtually none of this is told to the player firsthand. And I get it, like, this is what they were going for, but even just like a single other NPC to interact with, ideally one that's not trying to fucking murder you, would have at least been nice. It's also worth considering too that this is only the first episode out of 3, which means that the whole thing ends on a cliffhanger, which I can't see being resolved anytime soon either. I mean, there's still more than enough content in value in everything you're getting up until that point. But if you're expecting any questions to be answered or closure to the story, well, you're not going to find it here, bitch. Selaco does at least benefit from multiple playthroughs, because your weapon kits are going to carry across into the next run, meaning it's one less thing to worry about refinding. But even just the sheer amount of modifiers you can add to a new game mode offer up a whole bunch of options too. So either way, even with my list of minor grievances, this is another one of those instances where the product is such an easy sell, and I have no dramas recommending this game to pretty much anyone. Yeah, my name's GmanLives, and I approve this message. The long and short of it is where it matters the most, that being the shooting, Selaco absolutely excels. This is about as good as shooting faceless, militaristic bad guys is ever going to get. From that raw ASMR with the sound design, through to the gorgeous visuals and particle effects that really feel like we're playing a John Woo film in a 2.5D engine. And 20 or so years later, when these guys finally finish making that second episode, I'm sure they're going to be saying all the same things all over again.